To be here. We're starting a new series today, Stand, and you don't have to right now, but Stand. We're going to deal 5 weeks talking about subjects like stand out, stand up, stand strong, stand in, stand firm. And I seriously think these might be some of the most important in our time period today of living. This might be some of the most important messages you may ever hear, not because I'm preaching them, but because of the subject they deal with and the time period you live in. Because if you don't believe it, today is they're evil days. I mean, aren't they? You don't have to know much about news in the world today to know that things aren't good. And yet, how do we navigate these things? And that's the difficult, because Christians, honestly, Christians and Christianity in the last 50 years, 100 years have failed. That's why the church is in decline. That's why Christianity is, in fact, I read an article just this last week that a guy put out that said that within the next couple of years, Christianity is going to be so marginalized that it's going to be almost non-existent in the next 5 to 10 years in our country. And this is the United States. Now, I'm not talking about the world. I'm talking about the United States of America. And so that's sad. And you can tell just by the way if things are going. Every week I get notifications of pastors. More pastors are dropping out of ministry than ever before, which I just don't understand that. I do, but I don't. And on top of that, churches are closing their doors at an outstanding rate now because they're empty, and that's sad. And so what do we do, and how do we do it? And that's what we're going to talk about. And it's interesting when you come to this to understand, and I want to give you the key thought for our whole series here, really, today. If you take a stand, and this is the whole idea, if you take a stand, and when I say that, I want to qualify it. Take a stand for the right things in the right ways at the right time. So we got to qualify take a stand, because people take stands for the wrong things, the wrong reasons, the wrong times. If you take a stand, it can change the course and direction of your life. And that's why it's so important here. And that is something that we know in the history of America. Our history of our country is formed on that. You don't even have to have a Christian worldview to believe that statement I just made is true. But if you take the news for the last 5 years, you realize people have taken stands on crazy things, haven't they? We've had, and it's caused things like situations where we've seen Baltimore burning, Ferguson, Missouri burning, taking stands on different things. And of course, there's all these divisive things out there. Vaccination, that word vaccination, depending on what stand you take on it, that's a very divisive thing these days, and we're not going to talk about that today. But isn't everything? I mean, renewable energy and Greenpeace and all those other kind of things, and I don't even know all those things. I was listening briefly, because it made me laugh for a couple minutes. I was listening to actually, he's a political analyst. He was talking about how they've signed all these initiatives, and I know this is divisive. I didn't say I agree with it, but I heard him talking about things about how, I think it's 2032, 2035, everybody has to get rid of their cars to go to electric cars. And then he was talking about how that, and you may be in for that, and you may be totally against it. I don't care. I'm not here to talk about it. What I'm saying is people are taking stands over things that are just silly, and they're fighting over them. We're seeing people literally, let's give you one that everybody is really up in arms about, and I'm really discouraged about this. In the last 10 years, police. Police. There's a lot of back and forth on that. I remember my son, when my youngest son went off to college, he originally wanted to study to become some type of law enforcement. He actually thought he was going to go higher than that. My wife and I, we never told him this, but my wife and I were terrified. Because you realize there for a while it was open season, probably still is somewhat, but it's open season on policemen. And people are taking a stand for the wrong reasons. Defunding police and things like that, and you watch some of those towns, how they're working out now. This is crazy. So what is it that Christians should take a stand on? And more so, how do we take a stand? And today we're going to talk about stand up and the beginning of this, because just as I said, if you take a stand, it can change the course and direction of your life. The opposite's also true. Compromise over the wrong things at the wrong times can cost you way more than you can even imagine. And that's what we find ourselves in the state of problem today in America, to be honest with you. But the question I want you to consider this morning as we talk about this issue of stand, and we're going to look at a very familiar passage. Probably if you've grown up in church, you're going to be like, yeah, I know this story. But I want to point out some things that maybe you don't know in this story, or maybe you'll look at it from a different angle. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we take a stand for the things that matter most? How? Because I'm not here today really to discuss what is your personal things of standing up for. Of course, we know the Bible is the truth, and that's what we should stand up for, and we will stand up for here at Maple as long as I'm around. But how do we stand up for things that matter most? Because we have taken, and I've seen Christians, be honest with you, I saw Christians in Pensacola shoot abortion clinic doctors, thinking they were taking a stand for the right thing. Protest. I saw crowds of conservative Christians holding up horrendous statements I wouldn't even want my kids to even read or anything like that, words that are ungodly, and they thought they were doing God a just thing as they picketed homosexuals at Liberty University. Yeah. Now, just because I said both those things, I'm against abortion. Just I want to go on the record so somebody doesn't take me out of context here. And I am not for. I believe God made male and female, and that's all He made. And He made male to be with female, not male to be with male. There is no Adam and Steve. It was Adam and Eve, and that's the whole deal there. And you can talk to me later. But how do we take the right kind of stand for the things that matter most? Because we have missed the boat on this, and we are losing the battle. And when you think about it, the best place to go to in the Bible for this, and this is where we're going to be for the next 5 weeks, is the book of Daniel. So if you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Daniel. In way of preface, though, before we get into the scripture, Daniel, just so you know, for time's sake, Daniel is a very young man at the beginning of this book. When I say young man, he's probably pre-high school, junior high, somewhere in that age. 12 to 14 is basically what most people assume that he is. When King Nebuchadnezzar comes on the scene, world power, king of Babylon, and he comes in and he lays siege, the verse 1 tells us in Daniel chapter 1, he lays siege to the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in the southern half of Israel. It's the capital of the kingdom of Judah. They had a civil war and split, and the bottom two tribes formed Judah. And they had been holding on thinking that they were safe because the temple was there and they were just relaxing on the rituals of their faith, not really on the realities of their relationship with God because they had forgotten who God was a long time ago. And so the Bible tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar with his massive army comes and lays siege to it, and they win. And in 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar goes into the city, he destroys the temple, and he takes away some of the choice young people of the people of Israel to train them to be future leaders in Babylon. And now, when I read that in the first couple verses, and maybe you just sort of like, I just read it and just went with it, I always think like, why? Now, let's go back to one of the more recent battles we had. The battle in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, right? So we sent our military in there and we wipe them out pretty handily, and then we send in troops to occupy and all that. So if we were in that time period of Nebuchadnezzar and what he did, think about what he did. He sent in his army, laid siege, wiped everybody out, and then he told his guy here, Ashpenaz, the chief of his courts, he says, I want you to go in and I want you to get me some guys who are really special people and bring them back because we're going to make them our government officials. And I'm sitting there going, what? When do you ever do? Could you imagine if we had done that? We go over to Iraq, wipe them out, grab a bunch of kids, young teenage kids, train them for 3 years, bring them back, and they run our government. Now, you feel like that's what our government is doing these days, but we didn't do that, okay? I know some of you are thinking like, what's the difference? It just didn't make any sense until you understand the culture of Babylon, which is important to our story here. So we just assume that everything's just like America when we read through things, and it's not at all. So in the 8th century of what's going on here in Babylon, Babylon was the original dog-eat-dog society. They were. No exaggeration there. In fact, we would say it more like lion-eat-man society, okay? The king went to bed every night. I believe he went to bed with one eye open every night. Why? Because he didn't trust the people who were supposed to be watching out for him. He didn't trust the rest of his personnel in government. They were likely trying to kill him so they could get his job. That's what it meant to live in Babylon in the 700s BC, the 8th century BC. That's where we find ourselves. And so it makes a lot more sense when we pick up a reading in verse number 3 of chapter 1 of Daniel. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, and that's the man. We're going to talk about Ashpenaz a lot. Chief of his court officials to bring into the king's service. And that's so weird, but what you think about it is king wanted to be safe. So I'm going to take some young people who are very impressionable. I'm going to wipe out who they are, and I'm going to restart and reform them, and I'm going to make them loyal to me because no one else is, and they're from a foreign country, so they won't know what to do to kill me. They won't think that they can take over. So that's his idea. To bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. Now, when we get to this point, what we realize is Daniel, who we always just think of some normal, ordinary person, wasn't normal and ordinary at all. He was either part of the royal family or he was nobility in Israel. So he's of the upper crust. He's something else. And then we keep going as we look at this. Verse 4 goes on, and I think verse 4 was written by Nebuchadnezzar's teenage daughter or 20-something-year-old daughter, because this is like a wish list for young ladies, right? What they want is young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Isn't that amazing? Doesn't that sound like a 20-something like wish list, tall, dark, and handsome, and intelligent too, can earn a good living, and work in nobilities, and work in the palace? That sounds pretty good. And then he says, this is what Ashpenaz was supposed to do. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. And when you get to that in the ancient language there, the Hebrew, really it talks about a reprogramming. We're going to reprogram them. We want them to understand what we want them. This is an intentional and strategic plan. Verse 5, he goes on to say, the king assigned to them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Now, that sounds pretty good. Now, when you think about these captives, they could be in a lot worse shape, right? We could have been dealing with captives who were, they were put in jail, they were put in prison, they were fed, gruel or whatever you feed people, bread and water or less than that. No, they were fed pretty good food. And I'm thinking, these guys aren't suffering at all. But there's a problem with that. The food and the wine from the king's table was something, and the key there is from the king's table. From the king's table meant it was from the king's blessed food. Food that had been offered to other idols. Food that was dedicated to their gods, the gods of Babylon. And if you read early on, you would have realized too, he not only took these kids, but he took things out of the temple, some of their paraphernalia from worship in the temple, because there is no idols in the Judaism temple, in the temple of Israel. There was no idol because God isn't an idol. And so they took the next best thing and put it in their storehouses because that signified their power. And so the king is assigning these young men who he's taken, he's assigning them some of his own food fit for a king. And it goes on and says in verse 5 that these men were trained for 3 years. They were to be trained for 3 years. 3 years of tough eating good food and having everything you want and learning things and being reprogrammed. Sounds like a pretty good deal, but is it really? And we all know it's no. We already know the answer to this one. And because they were supposed to serve a foreign god. So the question we have to ask is, how do we stand up for the things that matter the most to us? And that's what we're going to have to answer here, because when we find this passage, what we realize is Daniel and his companions, and Daniel seems to be the leader of these, or at least the most outspoken, they have an issue because they have been trained up to their point, and that's one of the good things about the Judaism, the Israelite religion. They are the least to lose converts in their religion, because they start at the very first age, as soon as they're young, babies, and they start teaching them. And by the age of 12, they will have memorized the whole first 5 books of the Bible. Every Jewish young person does that. The first whole 5 books. Hey, you know what? I know Americans that can't memorize 2 words. These kids are memorizing 5 books of the Bible. And then if they're any good at it, they go on and they're promoted to learn to really memorize the rest of the Old Testament. Now, that's amazing to me. And they want to do this thing. And so they've already got this foundation. Being 12 to 14, you can see they're just coming out of this. They're just at this age where Babylonians think we can reprogram, and that was Nebuchadnezzar's plan. Because Nebuchadnezzar's got a threefold plan in place. He wants to make them think the way Babylonians think. He wants to make them behave the way Babylonians behave, and he wants to make them to believe what Babylonians believe. And those 3 things are not okay. Those 3 things are on the no-no list. And that's where we find ourselves here. And really, it's something that, yeah, we can say that's Nebuchadnezzar's plans, but really, is it any different than Satan's plan? Because Satan's plan is to deceive, to trick you, to get you to believe things that aren't true, to cause you to think you're okay when you're not, to think it's okay to be whatever you want to do, and that's not okay. That's Satan's plan. And what we realize here is right off the bat, these young men, they have been taught so well by their families. And you got to realize, when they were taken from their families were executed in their presence. It's a traditional thing. It's even done in modern day. Idi Amin and his group in Uganda, when he came into power in the 70s, he would take kids to follow him and make his army. He would take them and have them kill their parents right in front of him so that they become part of his group. That's still done today. There's all kinds of places. The Sudan, they're having civil war there in the Sudan. They do that now to recruit young kids, kill all their past so they have no family to go back to, and make them feel guilty about it so they'll move forward. That's what they do. And that's what a lot of these rebels do. Satan does that too in our life. He wants to kill not our earthly families, though. He wants to kill our heavenly family. So he's going to murder God in your eyes. He's going to do anything he can to make you think differently, to make you behave differently, to make you believe differently. And he speaks one language, and we've talked about this before. His language is the language of lies. That's all he speaks, and that's all he knows. Paul helped understand this as he wrote about the armor of God in the book of Ephesians chapter 6. He says this, and I just want to give you two of the verses here. Think about what he's saying in context of what we're talking about. He says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. He says something similar in a couple of verses down. Verse 13, he says, therefore, and he's given us all this explanation about the armor of God. He says, therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when, not if, but when the day of evil comes, the day that you're taken hostage, the day that your parents are murdered in front of your eyes, the day that God's assassinated in your mind, when all those evil things come and Satan's lying to you, you may be able to stand your ground. Stand. And after you've done everything, to stand. In verse 14, he goes on to say, stand firm. And that's the truth. And that's what Daniel learned even as a young man. Can you imagine being that young and having your family totally, give you an idea of how it worked. Nebuchadnezzar, when he comes in and lays siege to Jerusalem, the king decides he's going to try and escape. So there's a hole in the wall. Him and some of his guards and the rest of his whole family, they run out the hole. The Chaldeans catch up with them, Babylonians. They bring him outside to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar takes the king and holds him there. And he's forced to watch as his total family, every kid, his wife, his kids, every relative is executed in front of him. And then they take and poke out his eyes. So the only thing he'd ever remember was the last thing he saw was his kids being murdered. That's the sadistic culture of the Babylonians. And that's what Satan wants to do to us too. Satan wants to maybe not murder us physically, but spiritually, he wants to cause you to believe the lies. You don't need God. You don't need the church. You don't need Christianity. You're good enough to do it on your own. Wouldn't you need a day off? You need to stay home and sleep in. You'll do much better there. And you know what? Daniel understood as a young man, hey, you know what? I got to stand. And in order to stand, you're going to have to stand out. That's the whole idea today. See, sometimes you have to take a stand for something that matters the most in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. And Daniel understood that. And if you're never standing out and you're always blending in, you're just fitting in with everybody, then you're not truly committed to following Jesus, because when you follow Jesus, you'll be different. That's what Jesus knew. You're going to be set out. In fact, he uses the term holy because that's what we're called to be. We're called to be holy. And God expects holiness out of us. He doesn't expect anything less than that. Back in Daniel in chapter number 1, verses 6 and 7, we keep reading. It says, among those who were chosen, these are the ones that are pulled out, were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, those names, two of those names end in El. The El ending of their name in Hebrew would connect them to Elohim, El, God, the mighty God. And then the other two, Hananiah and Azariah, the Iah, I-A-H at the end of their names, connects their names to Yahweh, which was the Israelite name for Jehovah God, Yahweh. And so that's their background. Their parents had honored them, and names meant something back then. They didn't just pick out names that sounded good because they saw them on a TV show or something. They were names that really meant something. They were making promises to God. And so they were committed to living up to these names. And so verse 7 goes on to tell us the chief official, Ashpenaz, he gave them new names. That's a sign there. He gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. And each one of these names in the Babylonian had a different connection to their gods. So Daniel is going to be called Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. I remember when my kids were little, just a side story here, my wife knows I'm going to tell this one. My youngest son had a problem remembering the Hebrew children's names, and so I don't know if you have them around here, but we had this restaurant called Joe's Crab Shack, and so we always talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Joe's Crab Shack. That's how my kids remember them, so I was just one of those silly guys who did that. But that's the names we remember most of. Isn't it sad, too? Most of the time when we talk about the other three, Daniel remembers Daniel, but we remember him not as Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah. We remember him as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is their pagan names, their godless names, really. That's the whole sad thing. But these young men didn't want to do it. Now, what we've just read from verses 5 through 7 are the two-pronged attack to strip the identity of these Israelites. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to change them by changing two things. And the first one we see, obviously, is the change of names. Now, I don't know if you were born and you liked the name your parents gave you. I remember my sister always complained like she didn't like her name. She was named Sandra, too. I don't know why. She didn't like it. And I don't know if she's gotten over that or not, but you don't really have a lot of say in your name. Maybe you've changed your name. Maybe I know people that they took nicknames. But I don't know on those kind of things, but changing names, like sometimes people give you names and you're like, I don't like you calling me that, don't call me that, and that's rude. That's what they're getting here. And so we don't have a really big identification whether they liked it or not. They don't tell us, but that was the first stage, and that's what they're trying to do. We want to crush any sense of identity, so we're going to change your names. You're no longer going to be who you were. You're going to be something new. And for three of them, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, it seemed like that may have worked for them because we know them, once again, we know them more even today in church, in Christian settings, we know them more as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel was still Daniel, though. And I don't know, it was just because it was a whole lot easier to say that than Belteshazzar. But could you imagine having to say that, call him in, hey, Belteshazzar. It's a whole lot easier to say Daniel or Dan. And so that's the whole idea there. The second aspect, though, of the stripping of identity was not something as devious. It was the changed diet. And this is really something that was different. We've already talked about it. This is food prepared for the king's table. And the problem was this is food that's been dedicated to pagan idols, false gods. And some people would say, well, what's the big deal? Nobody's going to know. This is where we're talking about. You're going to stand out or you're going to compromise. You're going to stand out or you're going to do what they say. And it's interesting to see how they handle the situation because we know in the next verse, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, this is probably the most famous of the verses in all of Daniel, at least in chapter 1, says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief officer or official, that would be Ashpenaz once again, for special privileges here. He's going to ask him for something that's so important. He goes on to say, he asks the chief official, as we look at this, he asks the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, in our minds, we want to sit back and go, I'm not doing it. Most of us, we know we should take a stand in our lives as Christians, right? How do you take a stand, though, is the question we're asking today. And I wanted you to see something here that maybe you've never seen before. Daniel has purpose in his heart not to defile himself. He's determined beforehand that he's not going to defile himself because they were so involved with God. They believed in God so much, even in this time of being in prison. But notice what he did there. Once again, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission. Did you catch that? Most of the time, we just sort of skim over it and said, Daniel laid down the law and said, I'm not doing it. Is that what he did? Daniel actually was wise in how he dealt with it. Remember, Daniel's going to be one of the wisest men in all the Bible. He really is. Daniel asked permission of the guy in charge of him. And that's probably not how we would have dealt with it. See, as they go through these two changes in life, these two stripping of their identities, what we find is they didn't fight at all for their names. They didn't. Daniel, as far as we know, there's nothing recorded about them fighting over the names that they were given. Daniel didn't go, hey, I don't like you changing my name to some pagan god name. You know why? Because I believe this. Daniel understood that an outward name did not define who he was in his heart. An outward name did not define who Daniel was deep inside. And you know what? There are times that people call you names, people call me names. You know, I've had people say all kinds of hateful things about me. Well, you know, if you were a Christian, you ever had somebody say that to you? Well, you know, if you're a Christian, they want to define who I am. And you know, I used to take everything personal. And then I realized, you know what? Who they say I am on the outside doesn't define who I am on the inside. And that's something that helps. But that wasn't the main issue here. You see, Daniel realized this. Daniel didn't get upset. He didn't take a stand when it came to changing the names. When did he take a stand? He took a stand when it was God's name that was going to be defamed. When it was the food that they were going to make him eat. The food offered to other idols. See, Daniel said, hey, you know what? It's not about me. It's about my God. And he took a stand the right way because this is what's so important about Daniel. Daniel made a predetermined resolution. You see, before Daniel reached that point of his temptation to eat the king's meat, to eat the wine, drink the wine, before he was tempted to do something that compromised who he was, Daniel had pre-decided what to do and what he would not do. Daniel decided those things. And if you're going to stand out for God, you're going to have to make some decisions ahead of time. That's the truth. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to realize this, that Daniel made a decision before he was faced with the temptation to do what is right. That's the decision he made. And then, and what we understand as followers of Christ, our success, your success as a Christ follower will be determined by the decisions you make ahead of time. You know what, young people? Before you get in the backseat of a car and you roll around with a girl or a guy and end up getting a situation you shouldn't get in, pre-decide. Hey, you know what, a good one? This is for everybody. Hey, you know what? You know how my parents taught me when I was a kid? You predetermine on Saturday night that you're going to get up and go to church on Sunday. You don't leave Sunday morning. You know why? Because you're going to be too tired to get up on Sunday. You're going to have too many other things that bother you. And see, some of you, you're not successful because you won't determine ahead of time that you need to make those decisions. That's just the truth. And you can be mad at me for telling you the truth, but it is the truth. Hey, you want to know why I read my Bible every day? It's not because it's easy. It's not because I'm the preacher. You know why? Because I predetermined in my life that I'm going to get up and read my Bible. And I make that determination before I get up, because if I wait till I get up, you know what's not going to happen? Not reading my Bible. I predetermine before I get a paycheck that I'm going to give my tithe to God. Why? Because if I wait, I'm going to find other avenues for me to want to be greedy and spend my own money that I think I have, which is not my money, it's God's anyway. Those are the truths. Our success, your success as a Christ follower. Now, if you're not a Christ follower, you're off the hook here. You can do whatever you want. You can live like the Babylonians. But your success as a Christ follower will be determined by what you decide ahead of time. And it's so important that we make the right decisions. Because our choices, as we said at the very beginning, these choices, when we make them at the right time, with the right ways, right ideas to stand at the right times, could change the destiny of our lives. And often they do. See, if you're never standing out, and you're always blending in, and that's what we like to do these days, then you're really not fully following Christ. Because one thing you know about Jesus Christ is he stood out wherever he was. He stood out wherever he was. Even on the cross, he stood out amongst criminals. And you realize he was charged as a criminal, but he was so much different. Enough for a Roman centurion to say, hey, obviously this guy must be the Son of God. A Roman centurion said that? Wow. That's the truth there. See, when we get to there, what we have to realize is this Daniel 1:8 verse wasn't a one-time choice he made. It was a predetermined choice, but it was something that these young men had done, and it was a decision to stand out daily, every day, every day. They made a decision that set them apart, that stood out, caused them to stood out, and they stood out day after day after day after day after day after day and bad days and good days, on sunny days and rainy days, when people liked him, when people hated him, when people were trying to kill them. And if you go through the book of Daniel and you understand that principle, what you're going to see is a guy named Daniel, and he's staying with this principle of standing out every day. Even on days when he was told you can't pray, he still stood out because he prayed just like he always did. Why? Pre-decided. He made it easy. He decided before he got to Babylon, he decided he was going to honor God. That's where it really happened. That's the truth of the matter. Go down to verse number 12, back in Daniel chapter 1, verse number 12. Now, he's come up with this decision. How does he carry it out? Remember, he asked permission. Most of us would say, hang it, I'm doing what I'm blessed God, I'm standing up for God no matter what. Daniel said, no, that's not how we do it. I'm going to ask permission. So he gets with Ashpenaz, and this is what he tells Ashpenaz, who's in charge of him. He says, please test your servants for 10 days. 10-day trial period. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, says no teenager ever. I mean, think about it. Isn't this a crazy, see, we often picture Daniel, especially if you grew up and you saw the flannel graph Daniels, he was an old bald guy that got thrown into the lions. Hey, at this age, he's 12 to 14 years old. Okay? I don't know about some of you parents of teenagers, you probably would pass out if your kids came to you and say, hey, for the next 10 days, don't give me anything but water and vegetables. I had a son who doesn't even like vegetables. I'm serious. I don't know how to explain my son Daniel. In fact, that's funny. His name's Daniel. He can't tolerate vegetables. I mean, he could, but he won't. In fact, he has this like color code of what I'll eat and what I won't eat. If it's green, he's not touching it because he assumes green has to be a vegetable. So that maybe you're like that. But think about this. He says, I'm not going to demand anything. I want you to test me. Please test me. Please. Notice how polite he is. He didn't stand up and say, hey, don't you know I'm standing up for God. I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to make a show of it. No, he says, hey, please, you don't have to make this big deal. Please, test your servants for 10 days. I'm just asking for 10 days. Not a whole lifetime, just 10 days. Give us some vegetables and water. Vegetables and water. Give us some vegetables and water. And what happens here? Verse 13. Then compare. Test and compare. Compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. Now, remember, the other young men, they were all handsome. Remember all the description that I told you about? They were handsome, good looking, no defects, all these things. So this is a tough competition. And they're going to eat the proteins, and they're going to get the steaks and all these things, but we're not going to do that. He says, compare our appearance to the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants with accordance with what you see. So look at us visually, because I know you can't see my insides, so look at my outsides and see how it works. Verse 14. So he agreed, that is Ashpenaz. This is a major agreement that God forced on him because Ashpenaz, his life's at stake. Because he messes up the wrong way, he's going to die. So he agreed to this, and he tests them for 10 days. And verse 15 tells us, at the end of these 10 days, they looked, that is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they looked healthier and better nourished than any, might need to circle that word, than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Are you kidding me? I mean, good grief. So what we're saying here is these young men ate better or looked better after eating vegetables and water than the guys who ate what Ben eats on his blog or his Facebook page. I'm telling you. These guys over here, they're eating the lobsters from Maine. They're eating the steaks at the steak place. They're eating these fancy tacos and everything else. What else you got on that page, man? If you've never seen his Facebook page, you have to see his Facebook page. It's about eating. It really is. But Daniel ate vegetables and looked better. Now, I know people have adopted the Daniel diet. That's cool. I'm not sure that's really biblical, but you can do that if you want. It won't hurt you to eat some vegetables. It won't. The point isn't the food. The point was taking a stand at the right time in the right way. And here, it wasn't a forceful thing. See, Daniel made this predetermined thing, but he didn't make a public show of it. You got that, right? Daniel didn't say, I have to make a public show, because Daniel didn't have to stand up for God. He had to stand up for what was right in his life with God. Do you get that? It's different. So many times today, we take these public stands. I want to make a stand. You know what I'm against? I'm against this. And we tell the world all the things we're against, and the world hates us because as Christians, all we ever do is tell everybody what we're against. That's just the truth. And you know what we learn from Daniel? is you can stand out for the right things the right way, or you can stand out for the wrong things in the wrong way. And that's the question you have to ask yourself. How have you been standing out for God? Because I know Christians, let me just share this with you. Last weekend, I got to reconnect with my nephew I hadn't seen in a while. And we had a good relationship, but he's gotten away from God a little bit. He hasn't been in church in years. He got married to a girl who came from a Mormon background. They've got 4 precious kids that haven't gone to church. They've never gone to church in their life. And I sat back, and I love my nephew to death. I told him this last week at the end of the sermon, and they were doing the invitation. I put my arms around him, and I said, hey, man, I'm glad to see it. First time he's been in church in years. Is your little know anything about God? Isn't that sad? His story, though, is him and his wife, when they got married, she had that background, but she was willing to come to church, and she went to church for a while until that church ran her off by telling her all the things they hated. They hated her past, that she was from a family of Mormons. They took tough stands on things that they didn't need to take any stand on, and they made a fool of themselves and caused a family to walk away from God. Now, is it personal choice? Sure, it's personal choice. But you know, sometimes we help people make the wrong choices, don't we? When we stand out the wrong way for the wrong things, how are we standing out? Daniel didn't make a public nuisance of himself. And what happens? Because Daniel learned to stand out the right way, Daniel understood that, hey, you know what? It's going to work out. Look down in verse number 19, last verse here. All 3 years gone by now. Daniel has prospered, and this is what happens. The king, he's brought before the king, him and his friends. The king talked with them, that is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He found none equal, not one. The cream of the crop is out there. They've got no blemishes. They're smart, intelligent guys. This isn't a bunch of dummies that are out there against him. He's in a battle for supremacy with people that are high in their position. And the Bible says that the king found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. None equal. See, standing out wasn't making a demand. Standing out wasn't taking a stand. I got to picket, I got to protest, I got to do all these things. Standing out for Daniel was determining deep in his heart that he was going to serve God with everything he was. And then he politely asked for a change to be made, and God blessed that. And they entered the king's service. Think about this. Had Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah, had they compromised, we wouldn't have the book of Daniel at all. You ever thought about that? In fact, had they gone about it the wrong way and taken a stand like probably most of us would and said, I'm not eating, you can't force me to eat that stuff, and did a protest, you know what? Daniel and his 3 friends would have been executed. That's how they would have dealt with them. They've got plenty of guys that look good and all those things. The truth of the matter is, and this is the final truth, we don't stand out to make a statement. And this is something that we need to understand as Christians. As a church, we don't stand out to make a statement. We stand out because God called us to be different. That's why we should stand out. That's what Daniel understood that we need to understand in our world today. Because we live in a society that's similar to what Daniel lived in. We don't stand out to make a statement. We're not here to protest things. We stand out because God called us to be different. And that difference is living with Jesus in our lives.